Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Racial Segregation in Real Estate, a talk by Dr. LaDale Winling. My name is Hannah and I'm the reference librarian at the Duncan Branch Library in Alexandria, Virginia. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight to discuss this topic. And I'd like to thank Dr. LaDale for taking time out of his schedule to present to our community on this topic. In the chat box, you're going to find links to both Dr. LaDale Winling's website, where you can find his book and his other work that you can peruse. I'm also going to put a link into an event we're doing next week for the sit-in anniversary. Well, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about Dr. Winling. Dr. LaDale Winling is an associate professor of history and core member of the public history program at Virginia Tech. His research and teaching explore urban and political history in the United States, especially how space, architecture, and geography shape politics, economic life, and daily experience. His book, Building the Ivory Tower, examined the role of American universities in real estate developers in the 20th century. Professor Winling uses spatial data tools in both his print and digital works over the web. With collaborators in 2016, he launched Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America, on the work of the Homeowners Loan Corporation to map and grade the creditworthiness of neighborhoods in cities across America. In 2018, he launched Electing the House of Representatives 1840 to 2016 on congressional elections. This work has been featured in The Atlantic, The New York Times, on National Public Radio, and other media outlets. Please join me in welcoming Dr. LaDale Winling.
Great, thank you, and it's good to be here. I want to, first share my screen a bit. Let's see, did that work, Hannah? Great. So I am a 20th century urban historian. And one of the key kind of considerations and one of the key issues that historians of cities in the United States, especially in the 20th century, kind of come back to again and again is racial inequality, and especially the kind of spatial nature of racial inequality. Right. Basically, there's a kind of shorthand phrase that people often use about the effects that neighborhood conditions can have on like children's opportunities or their access to amenities and resources, whether it be well-funded local neighborhood schools or whether it be access to jobs, careers, transportation, things like that. And that shorthand phrase is geography is destiny. And it sounds like highly deterministic. We don't need to think of it as, essentially quite as simple as the zip code or the census tract that you come out of determines what your life prospects are or what your conditions are. But historians, looking at the past, as well as sociologists, economists, political scientists, have illustrated how local conditions and the development and the investment in infrastructure, in public services like education and schools, do shape and kind of make access to tools of mobility and opportunity either easier to access or more difficult to access, right? It basically makes economic and social mobility easier or harder. And in many cases, that comes down to the very neighborhood level, right? There's a set of historians, of whom I number myself, who trace this to real estate, right? In looking back, we see these racial and we see these kind of spatial inequalities in American cities. And people have realized that in some cases, in some ways, it comes down to real estate, right? And so what I want to talk to you about is kind of explain that process historically, some of the research that I and other historians have done, and how our real estate system has kind of racial difference and racial segregation at its base as a foundational element in who gets to live where, how we even assign value to properties, to real estate, and what makes a neighborhood desirable, high value, and what, because of that valuation, how does that create resources through, say, property taxes for municipalities and levels of government to provide services, and how does that kind of reinforce this access to amenities and opportunities? Basically, how do people in wealthy neighborhoods maintain their access to good schools, to public amenities like pools, like museums, like parks, and all of the kinds of forms of public health and opportunity that come along with that, and how are those withheld from people who live in disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? Let's see, I want to advance that. Yes, this is a long process, and the way I'll structure this, so the kind of story I'll tell, has in some ways at its heart like three kind of sets of Supreme Court cases, three movements to define what real estate is, how cities are organized, and how the real estate valuation and home finance sector, as well as zoning and city planning, came to define white neighborhoods, homogeneous and stable neighborhoods as like the highest goal and the ultimate constituency for real estate value and for city planning. And then how, in fact, diverse neighborhoods, and especially Black majority neighborhoods, were seen as both unworthy of federal and private investment, and were seen as kind of to the detriment of that greatest goal of white neighborhoods, right? So I'm sure you know about the Great Migration, this kind of process of Southern African Americans, largely from rural areas, moving to northern cities generally across the country, but especially Midwestern, northern industrial cities, some West Coast cities, starting in, say, the 19 teens, especially around World War I, but continuing over the course of the 20th century. Between 1910 and 1970, about 6 million African Americans kind of participated in this move, this shift from southern rural areas to northern urban areas. And this process and this demographic shift happened in cities in border states, even a little bit before and even a little bit more dramatically and more intensely than it did in kind of classic Great Migration receiver cities like Chicago, like New York, like Philadelphia. So in places like Louisville, Kentucky, in places like Baltimore, Maryland, we saw dramatic growth in African American population in the 1900s, in the 19 teens, and then certainly into the 1920s. And this came on the heels of, and in some cases at the same time as, a dramatic set of moves of European immigration, right? From the 1890s until the 1920s, there was kind of equally dramatic immigration from European countries to the United States. And so cities like grew extremely dramatically, and it put kind of traditional or long-standing city residents, maybe whose families had been in those cities for generations, in competition for jobs, for housing with European immigrants, as well as African-American migrants from the South, right? And this, one of the ways that this kind of competition, as well as this kind of set of ethnic and racial rivalries, kind of expressed itself first was through race riots, largely anti-Black race riots over the course of the first several decades of the 20th century. And in a number of cases, city leaders sought to kind of preserve order and preserve the reputation of their cities through a number of bureaucratic means. And I'll talk about a couple of those. One of the first is what's called racial zoning. It's often referred to as racial zoning. This is actually before land use zoning was like popular or had been kind of formalized or institutionalized. We could really think of it as simply a segregation ordinance, which cities, starting with Baltimore in 1910, wrote ordinances to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods. Right, so I mentioned that Baltimore was the first, but it was certainly not the only. And essentially it defined block by block throughout the city of Maryland, their first segregation ordinance, as a block by block as either white inhabited or Black inhabited. And they basically looked and saw and said, is this block already inhabited by a majority of either whites or Blacks? If it's a majority of whites, it's going to be a white neighborhood, a white block. If it's a majority Black, then it's going to be a Black block for forevermore or from here on out. And what that meant was that if an African American wanted to move into like a white block, especially in a white house, a white-owned house, or even to like an apartment or rental unit, they would be unable, they'd be liable to fine or jail or something along these lines. And so this move at what's called racial zoning, or these segregation ordinances, spread quickly to places like Richmond, Virginia, to St. Louis, Missouri, were entertained in places like Chicago, Illinois, and were later also implemented in like New Orleans, Louisiana, right? Major cities throughout the 19 teens. This actually was one of the first efforts of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which had been founded in 1910, as a means of opposing these kind of spatial and like governmental or municipal forms of white supremacy, right? And so the local NAACP in Louisville, Kentucky, when a segregation ordinance was established, challenged their segregation ordinance. And the same happened in Baltimore, and it never made its way up to the Supreme Court. A couple of the earliest founders and most active members of the NAACP opposed it. And they opposed it successfully in state courts. And so the appeals never made its way up to the Supreme Court. But the idea was, and especially in Louisville, this was promoted by real estate developers and real estate agents and representatives, because they said when African Americans moved into white neighborhoods, that property values dropped by about 40%. There's testimony in the court case from Louisville, Buchanan versus Worley, where realtors say this on a couple of different occasions. And so the local in Louisville, the local NAACP chapter argued this, challenged it through local and state courts, and made it up to the US Supreme Court. And it was argued by the national NAACP, and in fact, one of the most prominent lawyers in the country, a Bostonian named Moorfield Story. And here's a kind of portrait of him on the right. He was actually a secretary, personal secretary to Charles Sumner, who was a prominent abolitionist and like kind of Civil War era figure who opposed the spread and then a spread of slavery and advocated for the abolition of it. So he was kind of a connection. Moorfield Story was a connection to the abolition movement of the mid 19th century. And Story, as well as the kind of local officials and attorneys for the NAACP and so forth, successfully argued against segregation ordinances in Buchanan versus Worley. And I'll say this was like an absolutely brilliant test case to illustrate that basically it was a violation of the equal protection of the use of property. There was a kind of a white property owner who agreed to sell the house to an African-American man. So Charles Buchanan owned the property. He agreed to sell it to William Worley. And William Worley was one of the organizers of the local NAACP. And he said, I will purchase this, but I will only pay you when, like, if this is, this property does not, is not forbidden to be sold or is not prohibited to be sold to me and used by any local ordinances. And so they both agreed to this, and Buchanan said, all right, you signed the contract, where's my money? And Worley said, as a test case, it was intended in this fashion, Worley said, turns out, because of this ordinance, I cannot use this property, thus the contract is null and void, and I will not pay you. And so from this test case, they went to local municipal court, then they went up to state court, and then they went up to the US Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court that was largely populated by kind of progressive era Republicans from the McKinley as well as the Roosevelt and Taft administrations said, yes, like property rights are absolutely sacrosanct, and we have to have a functioning real estate system. So we cannot allow like these kinds of transactions or these ordinances to prevent the free flow and use of real estate, right? So the NAACP had one of its first major victories, and like theoretically, we would have a well-functioning real estate system in which racial segregation and discrimination in the use of property is not allowed. But in the wake of the Buchanan versus Worley decision, it opened the door to private contracts, private agreements that arranged for the prohibition and the prevention of African Americans from purchasing real estate in like neighborhoods that were, largely white. Right? Basically, the Buchanan versus Worley decision said you cannot have state action. You cannot have a law that discriminates and prevents the use of this real estate, but it left the door open to private contract. And so we have the rise of racially restrictive covenants around this time. They existed, back beginning in the 19th century, but they, in the 19-teens, and especially in the wake of Buchanan versus Worley, became much more popular and much more widespread in their use. Right, and those are basically contracts, and they can exist in two fashions, two forms, in which one says like a property cannot be sold, used, rented to, leased, or occupied by someone who is not a member of the Caucasian race. In many cases, they say may not be used by someone who is a member of the Negro race, right? African Americans nationwide were the most frequent target, but by no means the only. They would be written against to prevent the use by Jews, by Mexicans, by Indians, by Asiatics, Orientals, as well as sometimes catch-all phrases like anyone not a member of the Caucasian race. And here I have an example of this kind of restriction. This is actually out of Chicago, right? You can see restriction that no part of said premises shall in any manner be used or occupied directly or indirectly by any Negro or Negroes, et cetera, like except by servants' quarters by inhabited by Negro janitors, et cetera, or janitors or chauffeurs employed thereon as aforesaid, right? And so these, as I mentioned, were adopted by and embraced by the real estate industry. The National Association of Real Estate Boards, which was based in Chicago, but was kind of the governing national body for kind of national leadership for real estate agents and developers and so forth across the country, adopted these, and a famed real estate developer out of Kansas City named J.C. Nichols, who was behind the very prominent and still desirable country club district in Kansas City, promoted this and said, I first started using these kinds of racial restrictions, and I was kind of piecemeal promoting them to my prospective buyers because it ensured that the house they bought now or the neighborhood that they bought now would still be the same kind of neighborhood 10 years from now, 20 years from now, something along those lines. It ensured stability, both demographically as well as in terms of like building style or quality of construction or lot size or density. Restrictive covenants need not be explicitly racial. There are restrictive covenants which say minimum lot size or minimum home value or something along these lines, but far and away in the early first half of the 20th century, some of the most popular forms of covenant are racially restrictive covenants. And so given the popularity of these, they began to be used in increasingly standardized manner in like cities across the country. This led to the identification, the NAACP, especially in Washington, DC, kind of hand in hand with the law school at Howard University, identified racially restrictive covenants as a problem for Black opportunity, Black uplift, and like enjoyment, Black enjoyment of kind of property rights, one of the benefits of citizenship. And so a kind of key case where the NAACP challenged, this time unsuccessfully, racially restrictive covenants is Corrigan versus Buckley. And in the audience here, we have some people who do research on racially restrictive covenants in Washington, DC, because there were a wide variety of challenges and activism around covenants, in part because of this kind of location and the connection to the law school at Howard University. So you should check out, I'll show something from their effort, Mapping Segregation DC, part of a broader effort called Prologue DC. And Moorfield's story at the very end of his career kind of geared up in one of his last cases to argue this, and kind of worked with and then took over before the Supreme Court took over from the kind of local DC lawyers to argue that these were another form of the same kind of racial discrimination and the prevention of equal protection of property rights for African Americans, the same kind of idea in a different form that they'd argued against in Buchanan versus Worley. But Worley and the NAACP lost. And in this case, it was not that there was a specific ruling against their legal arguments. It was that the court ruled that a restrictive covenant was a private contract, a contract between private individuals. And so, first of all, equal protections guaranteed by the Constitution in the 14th Amendment could not reach into private contracts, right? That was only about state action and kind of like government programs in action and so forth. That was the first thing. Second thing, because this was Washington, D.C., a federal district, it was not covered by the 14th Amendment, that many of those kind of like Reconstruction era and end of Civil War abolition type amendments and pieces of legislation applied to the states, but not to the federal district, right? We remember that Washington, D.C. only in 1973 kind of had some of those, became its own kind of autonomous city rather than a federally run district. And so the Supreme Court said, we did not have the jurisdiction to rule on this because it's a private contract. And this opened the door to the very widespread use of racially restrictive covenants, because the National Association of Real Estate Boards drew on the example of the Corrigan versus Buckley covenant and basically said, this is a model, this is a template that has been ratified by the Supreme Court and is legal all across the country. So real estate developers and agents and officials, you can use this. And so there was a man who was the general counsel of the National Association of Real Estate Boards named Nathan McChesney, who made his living not just as a lawyer, but a particular kind of lawyer. He worked at he worked with an organization called the Universal Code Commission. And basically what those lawyers did, it was a kind of collaborative organization. What those lawyers did was they devised laws, or they kind of proposed revisions to laws that would not only hold up in one community or in one state. They said, we need to think about this in a fashion that will apply nationwide, that we need to think about how to create a universal standard for any kind of law. But he was expert in creating these kind of legal documents that could work all across the United States. And so McChesney wrote this kind of model covenant that was then used across the country. And so from the mid 1920s, really until the late 1940s, racially restrictive covenants, as you saw, of the type that you saw, were created in, I would go so far as to say, every city, or nearly every city across the country, and in many cases covered a majority of the residential districts in cities across the country. There's now a organization, or it's like coalition of these kind of local covenants researchers who are gearing up to enable people to to research these in their own communities. And I anticipate that while we've seen individual cities where it's been something like Chicago, where I do research, estimated that 80% of residential the residential districts and neighborhoods were covered by restrictive covenants, it's a significant majority in a large number of cities across the country because of the work of the National Association of Real Estate Boards. In the course of the 1920s, we have this kind of continuing process of urban growth, industrialization, and continued immigration and migration of African Americans. And this throws the kind of real estate industry, in many cases, into chaos. There's a set of researchers, economists at Northwestern University, led by a man named Richard Ely, who founded the American Economics Association, was one of the most prominent economists in the country for, kind of like 50 years. He was, in fact, one of the graduate advisors of President Woodrow Wilson when Woodrow Wilson was in graduate school at Johns Hopkins. And this coalition of economists, as well as in collaboration with the real estate industry, with Naacp, devised both the process and the profession of real estate appraisal. And they promoted the use of racially restrictive covenants, and they also devised ideas. It was almost kind of a think tank, as well as being like a research center on real estate. Developed ideas that were on how to make real estate more efficient, more orderly, more scientific, more rigorous, more understandable, and to make the work of real estate agents more professional. And so their work, let's see, was in the air in the 1920s. And with people like McChesney, as well as Richard Ely, with their ideas kind of in the air when we see the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, and the crisis of the financial sector and home finance and home building sectors, federal officials turn to these kinds of economists and professionals in Naacp. And people like Richard Ely say that federal officials, whether it be Hoover or whether it be the Roosevelt administration, say, we've got a crisis here. Who has ideas? And Richard Ely says, I do. And he actually knew and was friendly with both Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt already. So it was not a hard sell. And at this point, the crisis was so significant that it's estimated that a third to a half of all home mortgages across the country were in default, right? And with the Hoover administration created the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and then after the election and inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt, in his first 100 days, they passed the Homeowners Loan Act, which created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was tasked with rescuing the financial sector and homeowners. And HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, refinanced 1 million mortgages, about a fifth of all mortgages across the country. And what they did, there was no kind of national real estate information clearinghouse. And so what HOLC did was it asked appraisers, and it asked realtors, and it asked lenders, and it asked developers in cities across the country, every city with more than 40,000 people, where are the good neighborhoods where we should invest, where we should subsidize home ownership? Where are the bad neighborhoods where we should not invest, where we should not subsidize mortgages, and where we should be worried about changing conditions? And so this, I'll show you, led to the process that we know of as redlining. So this is a project that I work on, mapping inequality, and we've worked in the National Archives to find this survey, I mentioned that Holk officials asked realtors and lenders and so forth across the country, where are the good neighborhoods, where are the bad neighborhoods, and why? And those federal officials were drawing on, and in fact employed, colleagues of Richard Ely, people named Ernest Fisher and Frederick Babcock, who had worked at that research institute in Chicago at Northwestern University in the business school, and then in many cases went to work for Holk and wrote textbooks and rewrote the standards for appraisal and home valuation, right? So the idea, there's no inherent idea about home value or how to establish like the value, what's the basis of it. And as an illustration, in the 1920s, there was a debate between three types of ways of calculating home value. One was market value, and that's the one that we use now, where you basically say what other houses like this have sold in the nearby area recently. That's a sign of what people are willing to pay. But there's also the capitalization, kind of an investment, and basically says, how much rent could you get on this property, whether it be like an industrial concern, like a factory or something like that? How much money could you make on it? And because of that rent, or because of that profit, how much could that be capitalized at? More or less, we could think about it for houses as how much rent could cover the mortgage on that house, and then thus how much the monthly mortgage would mean how big of a mortgage, or like basically what would people be willing to pay, or what would it be economically feasible to pay for a property. And the other mode would be reconstruction. Like basically, if it burned down, what would it cost in terms of design and materials to rebuild it as it was? And so there was a debate, and capitalization, or that investment, won the day in the 1920s and 1930s, but subsequently the comparable sales, or the market value method, kind of wins to this day. Right, so that's like a human-made decision. It's not an economic fundamental. There's nothing natural about it. People had to decide on that, and there was arguments about this. But with this survey, where shall I look? Yes, there was some of the results of these surveys. And so these are called area descriptions. So this is a property on the south, a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, which says, this is in the midst of the Black Belt, it says located between 35th and 67th. This is a blighted area, 100% Negro, predominantly apartment buildings. Realtors are guessing as to what the ultimate result will be when so many of this race, African Americans, are drawn into this section from the already Negro blighted district. It says at this southeast corner of South Parkway and 60th, a brick apartment house of at least 24 flats in a restricted area is reported as owned by Joe Lewis. And there are a handful of kind of expensive properties, but the trend of the colored people will now be accelerated towards this park and the water frontage along Lake Michigan. And there are small areas that are restricted to whites, restricted through racially restrictive covenants. But this section will ultimately go colored. Washington Park is already doomed. Right. And so these are the kind of brutal and blunt evaluations of almost exclusively white real estate appraisers and professionals and so forth, reporting to the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And so with this, the Homeowners Loan Corporation then created this kind of set of maps. Let's close that and go back, where we get this term redlining, which said that these largely suburban, largely low density neighborhoods populated by professional class whites were the best and the most worthy of worthy of investment and worthy of home mortgage guarantees. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was the emergency body, worked with the kind of long-term agency, the Federal Housing Administration, to kind of develop these this information clearinghouse. Both HOLC and FHA employees worked together, and in many cases, like I said, came out of this kind of think tank in Chicago. So this is Lake Forest, and it says 98% improved, but they have considerable ground. It's low density. Ground is slightly rolling with ravines, making an attractive residential district. And most importantly, in terms of population, there is no foreign families, no African Americans, upper class, and no infiltration or expected changes among the demographics, right? So this was a place that would later get plenty of like FHA and VA types of subsidies, mortgage guarantees through FHA and so forth, while the kind of redlined neighborhood on the south side that was 100% African American would find great difficulty getting these kind of federal subsidies and so forth. And so what happened in the process of this, the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA were the only lenders in town during the 1930s and the 1940s, right? There was not adequate private capital. And FHA and HOLC also offered long-term mortgages. Instead of like a 3 to 5 year jumbo loan or balloon mortgage that had been standard in the 19-teens and 1920s, they created the 15-year and then the 25-year fully amortized, self-liquidating mortgage, where the first payment was the same as the last payment, and they were low because it was spread over more months and more years. And so HOLC and FHA were empowered to really change the real estate sector. And FHA, in fact, was created in order to transform that real estate sector and home finance, right? That's what its intent was, and FHA still exists to this day. I wanted to say that there is, let's see, I'll go one more case that I'll just gesture at briefly, which is the NAACP, in part in conjunction with a man named Robert Weaver, who worked in the Roosevelt administration. He was an African-American economist. And then he eventually was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development during the Lyndon Johnson administration. But in the 1940s, he was doing research on restrictive covenants and racial segregation. And he worked with both Thurgood Marshall and a former law dean at Howard University named Charles Hamilton Houston, in a coalition of a wide variety of lawyers to oppose racially restrictive covenants. That decision in Corrigan versus Buckley that I mentioned, it said, we just don't have the jurisdiction to rule on this. But with that ruling, that kind of grew in importance, and other courts and other judges kind of imagined that it said more than it did. And so by accumulation and over many years, it got cited and it became an increasingly powerful precedent because people imagined that it said more and it carried more weight than it explicitly did. And so it took a wide, like a national coalition of African-American lawyers and a handful of largely like kind of Jewish civil rights activists in the 1940s to come together and oppose racially restrictive covenants. And there were a handful of fits and starts and somewhat successful cases. But in 1947 was the argument, and then 1948 was the decision in 4 cases, 2 of which came out of Washington, D.C., one of which was in St. Louis, Missouri, and one of which was in Detroit, Michigan. collectively are known by the St. Louis case, Shelley versus Kramer, which decreed that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. Yes, there were private contracts, but if a court ruled to enforce them and to say throw an African-American family out of a house, that was considered state action. That basically, and the 14th Amendment covered that kind of state action. So the judiciary was not outside of like the state. Their rulings were part of the operation of government and the state. And so this especially strong kind of post-World War II activism kind of led by the NAACP, but by no means only by the NAACP, experienced several kind of ebbs and flows. And it was, let's see if I can go back to view this, and say that it was not until the 1968 Fair Housing Act that redlining was explicitly abolished or made illegal, ruled kind of incorporated in its prohibition of redlining was written into legislation and public policy. And then kind of later, the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act guaranteed that banks, which had been kind of both created, chartered, and kind of trained by these federal officials, federal agencies, the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act ordered that banks that took deposits from like city neighborhoods or city like census tracts and so forth had to make loans and invest there. They couldn't simply take money out of those districts or out of those communities and then invest in like suburban housing or in kind of far-flung or suburban or rural like business investment, right? And so that 1968 Fair Housing Act, we probably know, was passed a week after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., right? And while we know him best for things like the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington and the kind of March to the Selma, in 1966, he moved up to Chicago and moved into a west side of Chicago apartment complex to protest racial segregation and kind of ghetto housing conditions. And so he took on and joined in this fight of housing discrimination and spatial inequality as a key form of like civil rights injustice. And like his death really helped catalyze the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It was not a coincidence that it was passed a week after his death, because it had been basically bottled up in committee, kind of sat on by segregationist Southern Democratic senators, especially. But even though 53 years on, the Fair Housing Act kind of like endures that process of kind of private redlining and unequal investment still exists to this day. There is a journalistic inquiry by what's called the Center for Investigative Journalism, or Reveal, did a study of metropolitan areas in 2017 and 2018, and it's called Kept Out, where they determined by using, kind of like federal data, that in 61 metropolitan areas, redlining is still going on. It's far, far more significant for African Americans, especially, to get home loans and mortgages than it is for whites, right? And even though there is kind of like housing legislation and the Community Reinvestment Act, the process of appraisal is still, which goes back to this think tank in the 1920s and a couple of professional organizations based in Chicago that were founded in the 1930s, still allows for kind of racial discrimination and unequal treatment of homeowners by some of their processes that are written. The practices are race neutral, but they're often done in such a way that it ends up discriminating against and undervaluing African-American homes and leads to lower home values and helps contribute to this kind of racial wealth gap. This is a op-ed I did in the Washington Post about the kind of legacy and the origins of real estate appraisal and how it endures to this day. These are all kind of forms of structural or systemic inequality or systemic racism. If someone is doing an appraisal, they need hold no hatred in their heart for African Americans, but the issue is that the process and the practices that have been established over time that are established best practices allow for it. And by the same token, the work of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, which not only accepted, but promoted racially restrictive covenants and advocated against the mixing of inharmonious races as a key feature of their underwriting processes, embedded racial racial inequality into the real estate system. And there has, even though there have been efforts, particularly legislative efforts to end it, there's a long legacy and an ongoing system of consequences of this. So you've probably heard about, say, urban heat islands, for example. Those redlined neighborhoods have fewer parks and fewer trees and have seen fewer recreational investments in cities across the country. And as a result, they're up to 10 to 15 degrees hotter within the same city during the summer as the kind of green lined or A-rated neighborhoods. And as you know as well as I do, that these long-term mortgages can have enduring kind of knock-on effects. My grandfather, who was a veteran of World War II, bought his house in 1950 and he lived in it until his death in 2014, 64 years in the same house, kind of maintaining and institutionalizing those investments from mid-century up until just a handful of years before. And we can think about some of those same processes, neighborhoods that were shaped in the 1940s, 1950s, still existing. Maybe some of the houses have been passed on to this day. And so that, I think, is part of the motivation or part of the justification and thinking of increasingly active reparations efforts that are going on in cities around the country. So I want to thank you for listening and for your patience, and offer some opportunities for question and answer, or deal with some issues in the chat and so forth questions that you've had up until now, or in the course of my talk.
So we do have some questions for you already. If you'd like to ask a question of Dr. Winling, feel free to put that in the Q&A box or chat box now. I'd like to start with a question from Lynn, who writes, how can making the average person more aware of historical racism in residential real estate improve responses to current racism in real estate? Are there current legal actions by the NAACP, Reveal, or other organizations to address discrepancies in home value appraisals, mortgage loans, eminent domain actions, and redlining and other practices? She ends with, how can we determine what current systemic practices are in the city of Alexandria? I know that you don't work specifically with the city. Mm-hmm. If you want to tackle the first part, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think first of all, like building awareness. There's been a great deal of journalism around, especially redlining, the kind of historical redlining, and thinking about some of the consequences that go on to this day. And I think that's especially important. There is a good bit of activism in a number of ways. There's certainly like researchers who are taking on I mentioned there's kind of like individual efforts and like a national coalition of people researching racially restrictive covenants, and in that process, working with the public to inform them about some of the consequences and some of that like the historical conditions of their community, which still affect their lives. There is, let's see, the NAACP, I think, this isn't like residential segregation is not one of their foremost issues right now. However, there's definitely a good deal of congressional effort around like rectifying redlining. First, like acknowledging it, and second, creating ways to build racial equity into things like environmental protection and environmental justice. And then I'd say, let's see, there was one. We're talking about the federal. So there are a number of efforts and issues. Oh, and I would say that the National Association of Realtors, that's the successor organization of the National Association of Real Estate Boards, which is kind of one of the villains of the story from the teens and the 20s and 30s, has done a pretty significant about face. And so they acknowledge and have apologized for their historical role in facilitating racial segregation. They do some activism and education at the national level, basically to be anti-racist. That needs to filter down to the local level, right? That's national leadership, but they don't show houses. They kind of like set policies. And so that needs to work in, every community where there were covenants created or where steering happens or where there's kind of the ongoing process of redlining.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mary, who writes, is it true that funding for schools is proportional to the amount of taxes collected in the area surrounding the school?
I'll say yes, although it depends. Basically, state by state, it depends. I grew up in Michigan, and largely up until the mid-1990s, public school funding was more or less exclusively determined by local property taxes. Either the municipality or the county would collect the property taxes and then redistribute those by a formula to the school districts. And there were specific elements of your property tax that went into funding schools. That was changed a little bit to be a mixed sales tax and state level. But largely, yes, that has been the dominant system. And so what the specifics in any community are changes state by state and community by community. But yes, property taxes which come from property values, are one of the key elements of funding schools, and are one of the reasons that we have like dramatically unequal educational resources, and as a key element of that kind of spatial and racial inequality in metropolitan areas.
Thank you. Our next question, have you done any research on the role of civic versus citizens organizations? And can you talk about the difference between the two?
I would say, well, I'm not quite sure how the questioner is using those two terms specifically. If you have a follow-up to distinguish those, I'd be happy to address that. I would say that I do, maybe the way that you're operationalizing it is civic is like basically with the backing of a municipality, or it's, empowered by the city commission or something along these lines, versus citizen as a private organization. Certainly in the spread of restrictive covenants, these kind of citizen organizations, they're often known as improvement associations, in some cases, restriction associations. I mentioned that there were two kinds of kind of restrictive covenants. One is set on a whole, by a real estate developer for the whole plat, right? Before a house is even built or sold. And that's the kind of like J.C. Nichols type. But then there's another, which is known as a petition or an agreement. And those are a group of neighbors who band together and say, we want to make sure this neighborhood stays white and stays as it is, for the foreseeable future. And so those kinds of improvement associations are definitely a group that I research and that my students research, because in many cases they drive this process, or they're using the tools of the state to kind of advance racial segregation. If I'll give another shout out to the people at Mapping Segregation DC. They've got some maps here, which if I can just let me share.
While you pull that up, I'll just say that they reached out to say that their company that they founded is Prologue DC, and one of the projects they work on is Mapping Segregation DC. So links to both of those organizations are in your chat box for any viewers who are interested.
So this is Washington, D.C., right? And of course, these patterns, I'm sure, kind of continue, but they're researching and they've illustrated that these red areas are basically like local citizen organizations that have created the covenants, whereas the blue ones are largely by developers, basically deed by deed or plat by plat. And so citizen organizations definitely have in the past, and homeowners associations now have the reputation for kind of maintaining that same role. I will not say that they exclusively do, but there are patterns of exclusion that kind of persist into the present.
Thank you. So I want to quickly go back to Lynn's question. Lynn, you asked about the city of Alexandria specifically. I actually have another staff member here with me tonight who can answer that question a little bit about what is the city of Alexandria doing to determine what is the city of Alexandria doing on this topic? Take it away, Jean.
Hi, my name is Jean Pecori. I work for Alexandria Library, but I also work for the city's Office of Race and Social Equity. And I've been seeing a lot of presentations recently that have been coming out of planning and zoning. There is the work from Dr. Kristen Moon. She has been going through all the planning and zoning records to find out where there have been racially restrictive covenants, and they are working on, and there are some people on this call who might know this better than I do, so please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But there are going to be steps that homeowners can take to expunge those covenants from their deeds. I know it's going to be a process that you have to go through the clerk of court to go ahead and do this. And I believe the city is going to be making more of this information public. Right now, it's still in the research phase, but I have seen several presentations on it, and it's mind blowing. It's impressive. So keep your eyes open for it.
All right, do we have any final audience questions for Dr. Winling? I'm going to give everyone a chance to type in those final questions while I tell you about our next event. On Thursday, August 19th, Matt Spangler, the creator of the Out of Obscurity documentary about the 1939 Alexandria Library sit-in, will join us for an interview with Library Director Rose Dawson. We'll begin the night by showing a sizable clip from the DVD and then launching in with an interview about the making of the Out of Obscurity documentary. So that'll be next Thursday, August 19th at 7 p.m. I do not see any final questions for Dr. LaDale Winling. So I'd like to just take a moment to thank you, Dr. Winling, for joining us here tonight. And I'd like to thank the audience for taking time out of your Wednesday to talk about this topic. Do you have any final words for the audience, Dr. Winling?
Well, this local effort in Alexandria that you point to kind of excavating the covenants, and I think is a worthy one, whether in Alexandria or in any kind of community for people who are watching this, like in the future. And I think it can be extremely illuminating and surprising. And I think is an important means that people can kind of grapple with, both to understand, like the legacy of real estate and the development of the kind of modern real estate regime that we have, but also, to think like, why do some neighborhoods suffer? Why do they have bad reputations? And why do some neighborhoods have like good reputations? And like, are they continually desirable generation after generation? It's not just because of like the people who live there. It's because of the policies that we set up and the kind of tools that we use to create our communities. This is all kind of, this is all changeable. This is all, had to be created by humans in the first place, and it can be kind of recreated in a new mode. And that I think actually can be an important role of historians. We're not simply working in an ivory tower. We can work with communities to help them kind of excavate and to understand these processes in the past that still operate on us today.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this look at our recent past, and I hope people in our audience got something out of it. Please, if you're interested more in this topic, keep an eye on City of Alexandria to see what else they're doing. And like we've said a couple times before, mappingsegregationdc.org is one place where you can look at some of this on a more local level to our area. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Winling, and thank you to the audience. I will see you all next time.